This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Make your next move. Hey Wisecrack, Jared here again, this time to discuss the punching bag of the DC universe. No, not that one, this one.
It's cherry.
Now, since everybody's already beat the film up for its shameless franchise plugging, its slow plotting, and well, save Martha! That, we're going to focus on something else, Batman v Superman's ideological failings. So, let's see if it bleeds.
You will.
Welcome to this Wisecrack Edition on Batman v Superman, what went wrong, and of course, spoilers ahead. One of the biggest challenges facing the architects of the DCEU is how to make Superman a relatable character. After all, it's hard to identify with an indestructible, selfless, godlike figure. So what was their solution? Well, a pretty smart one if you ask me. They kinda did what was done in The Last Temptation of Christ. Took a benevolent messiah figure and emphasized his vulnerabilities, flaws, and most importantly, doubts.
I'm a man like everybody else.
Quiet.
Doubts as to whether he can or should carry the burden of divine status, essentially making him more human. We see this push and pull as Superman decides between being a benevolent savior or just focusing on what matters to him, namely Lois. The problem is, this botches a fundamental part of having a movie about the rivalry between Batman and Superman, namely having them embody different ideologies. This doesn't really happen. Enter Batman v Superman's biggest inspiration, Frank Miller's graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns. The film takes a lot of its cues from this work. An older Bruce Wayne? Check. Superman being hit by a nuke and then healed by the sun? Oh yeah. Robin's memorialized costume in Batman's lair? Yup. Even the central fight between Batman and Superman is more or less taken from the graphic novel, with Superman trying to reason with Batman and Batman having none of it. But beneath the mask of both The Dark Knight Returns and Batman v Superman lies an unlikely inspiration, one that solidifies the all-important ideological distinction between Batman and Superman, Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. Well, at least it does in the graphic novel. Rand's novel follows Howard Rourke, an experimental architect who faces near constant opposition from the rigid establishment. And yeah, I know you're thinking, what the hell do superheroes punching each other have to do with architecture? Well, not only has Zack Snyder been trying to make the Fountainhead movie for years, but Frank Miller cites Rand as a big influence on his work. Per Miller, he was drawn again and again to Rand's ideas and how she took the fate of humanity out of the hands of the convenient Big Brother and into the hands of individuals. In particular, both Miller and Snyder seem drawn to Rand's depiction of male heroes. In The Fountainhead, protagonist Howard Rourke is the ideal man, a man who, no matter the obstacles, achieves his goals and never gives up an inch on his integrity, even if that leads to conflict with others. This Randian hero is defined by ethical egoism, the belief that the best course of action is always what's in your best interest. Only through pursuing your own self-interest can you ever hope to achieve happiness, a central tenet of Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism. To Rand, a male hero must be a radical individualist, unwilling to bend, smarter than everyone else, and well, not too shabby on the eyes. Sound familiar to a certain Dark Knight? Rand's ideal man fits Miller's Batman to a T. He's a super rich, handsome playboy with a genius intellect who refuses to bend to anyone's will but his own. It's Batman's adherence to Randian egoism that enables an ideological conflict between Batman and Superman. Individualism over collectivism.
We are criminals, Clark. We always have been. You're still one too. Only difference is you have a boss.
And you answer to no one.
Batman faces constant obstruction from the US government,
Batman, you are under arrest!
who task the ultimate conformist to stop him, Superman. In Miller's work, Superman is the anti-Rand figure, a character whose self-sacrificing moral righteousness and commitment to doing good marks him as a government stooge.
Either shut it down, or one of these days, someone with authority is going to tell me to come stop you.
Much of the drama in Miller's graphic novel stems from these differing ideologies, the individualism of Batman versus the conformism of Superman. Now, whether you agree or not with Rand's philosophy, there's no denying that Miller successfully instilled the spirit of her theories to create a compelling interior conflict between our two titans. So while Frank Miller pulled this off with flying colors, Batman v Superman's integration of this philosophy is where it all goes wrong. First, let's give props to what they get right. Batman. Affleck's version is pretty much in line with Miller's Randian take on the character. He's handsome, almost supernaturally athletic, smarter than everyone else, and catnip for the ladies. Batman's also a complete individualist, refusing to bend his will to anyone, even the judicial process.
We're criminals, Alfred. We've always been criminals. Nothing's changed.
He even brands criminals so they'll be shanked in prison. Now, I watched the whole movie being pretty confused as to why Batman wanted to fight Superman in the first place. But here too, I think there's a nod to Rand. If Batman is so concerned about this godlike Superman, it's because any kind of god ruins the whole ethical egoism thing. How are you supposed to make your own choices based on your own rationality when there's something objectively greater than you? Rand was famously an atheist for this reason. So they get this Randian version of Batman right. But it's with the depiction of Superman that things begin to get muddled. They couldn't create a purely benevolent do-gooder Superman because that would be boring and impossible to relate to. Conversely, they decide not to make him the collectivist stooge that Miller made him because, well, the audience is supposed to like him just as much as Batman. And we've got Justice League films to make, people. So what do? Previous depictions of Superman have focused on his self-sacrificing goodness. In Christopher Reeve's iconic portrayal, Superman doesn't save people for his own betterment, but simply because it's the right thing to do.
I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
Be it rescuing a cat from a tree, or catching Lois from plummeting to her death. The Superman of Batman v Superman, however, looks like he's stuck performing the most tiresome 9-to-5 job imaginable. Since gods shouldn't whine about saving humanity, the film constantly undercuts the perception of Superman as a purely benevolent Christ-like hero, which later, Batman just straight up tells Superman face to face.
You were never a god. You were never even a man.
Superman's crisis manifests into two warring identities. The classic Superman, the god, benevolent and Christopher Reeves-like, and Superman the man, which for Snyder means a Randian Objectivist, i.e. a guy who flies to the Middle East to save Lois, but leaves all the other innocents to die. This internal conflict is pretty bluntly stated by Martha Kent.
Be their hero, Clark. Be their monument, be their angel. Be anything they need you to be. Or be none of it. You don't owe this world a thing.
For Martha, there's no difference between choosing to be a benevolent messiah or a self-involved objectivist. Both are equally valid. The important thing is that it's Clark's choice to make, and this rational choice is what marks a Randian hero. Later, the ghost of Jonathan Kent gives Clark his own advice, revealing the time he selflessly saved his farm from a flood. Yet, unbeknownst to him, the water went upstream, flooding another nearby farm.
While I ate my hero cake, their horses were drowning. I used to hear them wailing in my sleep.
Jonathan Kent here dismantles the notion of selfless heroism. There's simply no point to being the classic selfless do-gooder Superman, because there will always be another flooded farm you couldn't stop. When Clark asks Ghost Dad how he could live with himself after dooming the nearby farm, he responds,
When I met your mother, she gave me faith that there's good in this world. She was my world.
Dream Jonathan is kind of like a ghost of objectivism past, suggesting that true moral righteousness comes from bettering yourself, pursuing your own self-interest, and protecting the ones you love, because they in turn bring you happiness. Ethical egoism in a nutshell. So what choice does Superman ultimately make? Messiah or Randian hero? Actually, he doesn't really make a choice at all. At first, Superman seems to embrace Jonathan's objectivism, returning to Metropolis only to save the people who really matter to him, aka Lois and Martha. He even echoes Jonathan's parting words, telling Lois,
This is my world.
No, Clark, don't.
You are my world.
So what's his decision? Both. As a benevolent savior, he takes responsibility for the well-being of the whole planet. But as an objectivist, he also mentions he's doing it all for Lois. 5 seconds later, Superman sacrifices himself in the most messianic fashion possible, Christ-like with his arms spread out. Heck, there's even a makeshift cross behind Superman's corpse. Superman's ambiguous philosophy becomes problematic since Batman v Superman is framed as an ideological conflict between Batman and Superman. yet none actually exists. The first time Bruce and Clark meet, the film pays lip service to what should be their differing beliefs. Bruce doesn't like how Metropolis and the world blindly trust Superman by labeling him as a savior. Bruce questions the very possibility of a superhuman benevolent savior because, as he's seen, even the best can turn bad.
We just have a bad history with freaks dressed like clowns.
And Clark thinks Batman is a vigilante who needs to be put in check.
Civil liberties are being trampled on in your city. Good people living in fear.
This is a similar ideological conflict as Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, but Batman v Superman, instead of exploring the dynamic further, immediately upends it. The world turns against Superman.
Headline: End of love affair with man in the sky? Question mark.
Because, like Batman, he acts on his own accord.
I'm not saying he shouldn't act. I'm saying he shouldn't act unilaterally.
And by using objectivism to make Superman more relatable, the film ends up shooting itself in the foot, because now there's almost no ideological difference between Batman and Superman. So in a film that requires a conflict based on differing ideals, that's based on a source material showcasing this ideological divide, Batman v Superman instead becomes a Randian hero versus a maybe sort of Randian hero who can't decide if he wants to be the divine savior the world wants him to be. So in the end, the film presents no preference of heroics. Whether one should sacrifice oneself for the greater good, or only keep their own interests in mind, is immaterial, because the solution presented isn't that one kind of heroics needs to be put in check while another promoted. Rather, the message is more heroes. Aquaman, The Flash, Cyborg, and that they all should form their own team.
Help me find the others like you.
AKA the Justice League. So instead of the film espousing a clear philosophy, everything just becomes muddled. Quite simply, it's a mess. But it's an ambitious mess, and for that, it deserves credit. And hey, maybe Justice League will get it right. Thanks for watching, Wisecrack. Peace. Hey guys, thanks again for watching. If there's one thing we've learned from the follies of Batman v Superman, there's nothing wrong with having grand ambitions, but just make sure you have the tools to do it right. Whether you're making Batman fanfiction, independent art, or starting a business, you can confidently make your next move with Squarespace. So start your free trial today at squarespace.com/wisecrack and get 10% off your first purchase when you use the offer code Wisecrack. With Squarespace, you can build a super cool and stylish website fast. They've got professionally designed templates that look great and intuitive tools that are so easy. You really don't need to know a thing about coding to create something that looks awesome. We actually used Squarespace to create a site for our new show Film Legends that launched over at the Film Theorist channel. It took us less than an hour to use their super easy platform to create a great looking site. And I've never coded a single thing in my life, so trust me, if I can do it, you can do it. Head over to squarespace.com/wisecrack to start your free trial today. Don't forget to enter the offer code Wisecrack to get 10% off your first purchase. And thanks a lot to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. That's all for now, Wisecrack. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. Thanks again for the support. Peace.